Hello and welcome back to Charge, the podcast by Develop. I'm Louisa and my co-host here is Maria Christina.
Hello.
And our guest in the studio is Ed Dowling.
Hey.
We're in the Barclays Rise studio today and that's why you're hearing such crisp sound quality, so a big thank you to Barclays for hosting us.
Ed Dowling is Product Manager for Account Security at Transferwise. Transferwise is an alternative to banks and brokers. It allows people to transfer money internationally at a low cost through their peer-to-peer platform.
Now, Transferwise is London's fintech darling, as it is our first unicorn. It's currently valued at $1.1 billion US, and it has over 1 million customers. It became profitable in May 2017, and that's an incredible rate of growth.
You will have heard Ed on Charge before when he featured on the Twilio webinar about account security, alongside Develop's own CEO, Tom Mullen. We wanted to get Ed back in because there was still so much we wanted to ask him about his work at Transferwise.
Right, so what makes us curious at Charge is how Transferwise have scaled their security alongside massive growth. What challenges have they faced and how has their strategy developed? How can early stage fintechs learn from their experience?
So let's kick it off. Ed, could you start by telling us a bit more about yourself and your professional background?
Sure. So I guess by trade, I'm a developer. I'm an engineer. So I started my career completely self-taught, building apps and websites for clients, for a bunch of startups and agencies in Australia. And then kind of accidentally started a tech company called App.io in 2012. We ended up moving to Silicon Valley and raising investment from some of the Valley's best venture capitalists, 500 startups. And we were headquartered there and had offices in Melbourne and Sydney. I sold that company in 2015 and then decided to move to London for my next adventure. So 6 weeks after deciding that, suddenly I was in London, and then I went into a role at Ecasa, formerly called Splittable, who's a prop tech company, as their head of mobile, looking after their mobile products. And then in January 2017, I joined Transferwise as a product manager.
What drew you to security?
I think the security landscape is changing in a really big way. I think people are becoming really expectant of security. I think cybercrime and the profile of cybercrime has increased quite dramatically over the last couple of years. When you think around ransomware attacks, when you start thinking about Russian meddling in elections and all that sort of stuff, it's much more prominent than it was even just a few years ago. I think you have things like Touch ID and other things that are just becoming more accessible to consumers as well. So people are so much more conscious of security. And when we start talking about money and this rise of fintechs and all of these transactions moving online, it's just becoming there's so many questions, there's so many product decisions that you need to make around security that's actually quite fascinating.
So what does Transferwise's security look like today?
So the vast majority of our customers are protected by standard email and password. And it's been like that ever since Transferwise was born. So I think when you think about Transferwise's security model, there's kind of two sides to it. You have the account layer of security, which is giving someone access to their Transferwise accounts through email and password. But then there's also, once someone has made a transfer with Transferwise, there's a whole bunch of fraud and anti-money laundering protections that kick in. So there's kind of those two sides to it. So at the moment, most of our users have email and password, but then for our new Borderless accounts, we are mandating that users have 2FA set up. So that's two-factor authentication. And the reason why is because we're now holding money on behalf of customers. So people can have multiple currencies with Transferwise, and that's, increases the value of Transferwise accounts dramatically.
So you mentioned 2FA. What kind of 2FA are you currently using for the accounts?
So all of our 2FA at the moment is SMS, OTP, but we're actually moving to a solution called OneTouch provided by Twilio, which is app-based authentication. So effectively, authentication requires a user to open up the Transferwise app and they see a request, someone would like to log into your account, it's coming from an iPhone in Germany, and they can approve or deny that request. And so it's much more secure than SMS is. Mm-hmm. And crucially for us, it actually works cross borders. It's quite, as you can imagine, Transferwise is very much about international lifestyles, and our customers are constantly moving between countries. And SMS is inherently not mobile. You have all sorts of deliverability issues around SMS. You have lots of different hacks that are available for it. People are constantly changing SIM cards, which means that they can't access their Transferwise account. And so moving to an app-based security model for 2FA is solves all of those customer problems for us.
Yeah, so you're making your security as borderless as your accounts, essentially.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it. It's we launched a borderless account with a completely boarded, security solution, which isn't great. But I think that's just how startups work. And I guess like even though we are this big company, we still move quite quickly, and so we still call ourselves a startup. And so like, what can we do to provide a base level of security, and then how can we improve and iterate upon that?
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that you have to teach your customers, and we were talking about how we're definitely going through a learning curve of the importance of security in our society. I wonder how you teach your customers about the value of, say, downloading an app to authenticate your login on a computer.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I think we're seeing more and more mobile usage of Transferwise happening, which helps this campaign a lot, because people are, I think about 40% of our transactions are now happening through the mobile app, and that's gone up quite dramatically over the last few years. And so now it's viable enough that we can actually have people using that as a core part of the Transferwise experience. We've invested heavily in increasing the number of mobile developers we have. And so it's about like going to where the customers are and how they're already using the platform. It's also about, we focused a lot in copy and things like how do we actually talk about these concepts of 2FA, and because we, the younger generation, might, intrinsically know what a two-step login is. We might be quite familiar with it, but when you're talking about customers who are 50, 60, 70 years old using this platform, it's you've got to think through how you explain the benefits and the concepts. And so we're very lucky to have a copy team at Transferwise and a design team that we can work with to try and explain that in a unified way that makes sense for our customers.
So I was actually wondering, you say, so the authentication is through the app always, right? So what happens if you don't have the app?
So SMS is still like the base level that we require for two-factor authentication. So even if you don't have a smartphone, even if you don't want to download the app, you still get a level of protection through SMS. But when you do log into the app and you have SMS security enabled, we prompt you to upgrade. So it's not about forcing people to use the app. It's about like, hey, we actually have this more convenient, more user-friendly way for you to log into Transferwise. That means you don't need to enter a code that you get sent on SMS. It means you don't have to be changing SIMs around if you're traveling. And that makes a big difference to the convenience of it.
Right, so I mean, security and user experience are completely intertwined in this case. Everything has to be logical and easy to follow.
Yeah.
And how did you come to that conclusion that you could prompt people that way?
I think it's about you've got to put things in people's faces in a way, and not in an aggressive or obtrusive, in a really forceful way. But you've got to sell people on benefits, and you've got to design a really good user experience around security. So I think the biggest part of my job is actually balancing that security versus convenience factor. It's about the most secure service. If you want to make any service completely secure, just take it offline. If you don't want people's emails to get hacked, take Gmail offline. Like that's how you guarantee absolute security. But that's not very convenient at all. That's a terrible way to do it. So it's about how do you think through it properly? How do you design a proper product around security? And at Transferwise, we've done that in a very considered approach. We look at, we put SMS out there, and we saw like, hey, the customers are having problems because they're traveling, or they're not getting SMSs, and we can't really help them in that scenario. And so you start looking at how can we make it more convenient for them, and the answers often reveal themselves. You also have to test your assumptions as well constantly about what is convenient, what isn't. Like we'll run user testing sessions to make sure that customers understand what we're saying and non-customers understand what we're saying. Transferwise has 10% of the UK foreign exchange market right now, which is huge.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's massive.
Massive.
But it means that those early techie adopters, like they're long gone. Like we've already got them on board using the platform. The people now, the next 90% for us, that convenience and that trust element is so critical to them. It's like they've used their bank their whole life, and suddenly they're 40 or 50 years old with mortgages in Spain, or they have kids who are studying in India, and like all these different use cases. And for them, they need to be sold and convinced that it's okay to trust an internet company with moving thousands of pounds for them. And so that's, we have to be really mindful of that.
So it sounds like your security even now is iterative and developmental, and you've started in 2011, Transferwise?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So you've had nearly 7 years to develop it to this state that it's in now. I wonder, what was it like when the two founders first launched?
Sure. So I think, you've got to remember back in 2011, like, it was a very different place. Smartphones were still rolling out everywhere. I think they were just at that big turning point where, when the iPhone 4S came out, that they started to become really popular and everyone started to get an iPhone or an Android. And everything was still predominantly web-based. Apps were still coming onto the scene. So it's amazing how much has changed in the last 6 or 7 years. It's also amazing how much Transferwise has changed. When Transferwise first started, up until relatively recently, there wasn't a whole lot you could do if you actually got access to someone's Transferwise account. I know that sounds really interesting, but like, you couldn't, if I just had your Transferwise username and password, I couldn't steal money from you. I couldn't steal money from your bank account or from your credit cards. I couldn't see your credit card information or anything like that. Whereas now the product has evolved where, we can do direct debits from accounts where, you can use a previously saved credit card. Previously, you would have to set up the transfer in Transferwise, then go to your internet banking provider, log in through them, then send the money to Transferwise. So in the early days, the security element was placed, that kind of second half of security that I spoke about before with fraud and anti-money laundering. So we established really strong controls around that side of the security equation because that was where it made the most amount of sense, it was least inconvenient for customers, and we had the most regulatory pressure around ensuring we weren't supporting criminal activity, that we were doing everything above board, and that we were building that trust, that initial trust with customers. But now the landscape has changed so much for us, and really quite quickly, that this emphasis is now having to come onto the front side of the security equation.
How have your security concerns changed? I mean, so you say that it was fraud and anti-money laundering before. I wonder, how the balances shift and what new things have cropped up.
Yeah. So as we've become popular, we've become popular with customers, and we now have 2 million customers, which is incredible. But we've also become really popular with botnets as well. There's always a flip side to it. So. One of the most common sorts of attacks that we see happening on a regular basis is a credential stuffing attack. So people come to Transferwise with a list of email addresses and potential passwords for those email addresses, and they try to log in to Transferwise, using those credentials until they find a password that might work. And this is huge, for us, it's not uncommon for us to have 40, 50,000 IP addresses, unique IP addresses dedicated to attacking Transferwise.
And that's just every day for you?
Thankfully, it's not every day. I think my team would have an absolute heart attack if they had to deal with that every single day. But it's enough to keep us on our toes. And every single time it happens, we have to detect it. So we've gotten very good at detecting these attacks. We then have to see what have they done, how are they doing it, shut down how they're doing it, see what accounts have been affected by it, see what they've done to those accounts, what accesses they've had. We've never lost customer funds due to a hack, which is awesome. It's not happened, but we still have to be really mindful so that we can be honest and transparent with our customers. And we will always, if a customer's account is compromised, we always reach out to that customer, even if nothing bad has happened, telling them to change their password and that this is what's happened and we haven't found evidence of anything malicious, but at least giving them the transparency around it. So that has changed quite dramatically, and so that's forced us to do things which we aren't entirely happy about, like reCAPTCHA, for example. At times when we detect that we're under attack, we'll have to put Google's reCAPTCHA on there just to stop this huge flurry of attacks coming towards us.
What's reCAPTCHA?
Oh, so it's definitely that. You've definitely would have seen it. Its first iteration is when you've got those weird little letters and numbers that you've got to try and type in.
Oh yeah.
But the one that we're using is you have to say which pictures have street signs in them, or shop fronts in them, and then tap the images that have it. The good thing is 78% of our users who come to our website don't encounter that at all. We're able to detect that they're not robots, that they're not bots, and we can let them straight in without that protection. But there is still that 22% of users who do see it, which isn't an ideal user experience. But that's just, it's kind of that balance, of security and convenience. And we are looking at ways that we can avoid using that.
So on the internal side, when something like that happens, obviously having to deal with it is internally is high cost and time consuming. What are the steps that you have in place to prevent that kind of thing from happening? Has that also evolved over time? Yeah,
definitely. So naturally, as the company grows, you have you have to make sure that there are multiple people who can do the same job. So for example, the security team has an on-call rotation now. We have 2 people who are primary and a secondary person on call 24/7, so that if certain error rates start happening, if certain things start appearing in the logs, they're alerted, they're woken up, and they can come and deal with that straight away. So that's had to evolve, because it can come at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, and like that, we just have to be prepared and ready for that. Formalizing like incident response protocols as well, so that we know like when you detect this, what do we do, how do we handle that, how do we respond, is standardized. We have operations agents who are trained up in how to look at and analyze accounts, for example, and at how to deactivate and then communicate with customers, deactivate potentially compromised accounts and then communicate to customers what's happened. So it's about formalizing a lot of those procedures. When this first starts happening, there's no easy standardized approach that works for every company on how you detect these attacks and how you respond to them. So you have to evolve your response over time. So it started with one person in the security team literally like having a whole bunch of commands that he would run to try and figure out exactly what was happening. And while that still happens to an extent, we are automating and training up staff so that it isn't a single, one person who's responsible for that. Over time, we'll be building out, a security operations center that is fully featured to look at all of this sort of stuff on a real-time basis of like 4 or 5 people who are constantly like looking at whether we're under attack, how we're being attacked, all those sorts of activities, potentially fraudulent activities that are happening.
It sounds like a big operation, and yeah, as you're saying, it's grown over time. But most startups, their primary focus is not security. At what stage in Transferwise's lifetime did you start to implement that as a formalized procedure? And is it important, perhaps in hindsight, to have it earlier, or was it the right time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we have reacted very quickly to the need to have increased security, and we've done very well there. I think that there are certain things now that have been made a lot easier that make security more accessible for early stage startups than back in 2011 or 2012. So implementing something like 2FA right from the start is a lot easier now than it was. Like, this was still evolving no one really knew what 2FA was at all in 2011 or 2012. I think it's about, you've got to understand what is the risk. What is the risk of someone getting into our customers' accounts, and what damage can they do to brand and reputation, and to actually stealing funds. And so what is the power? So when that reaches a certain threshold, that's when it makes sense to worry about this sort of stuff. So for Transferwise, having stored account balances and having that level of responsibility for our customers' funds made it incredibly worthwhile. And the company has enabled that investment, which is great. I think that Transferwise can have the fastest product, it can have the cheapest product, it can have the most convenient product, but if we lose customer trust, it doesn't matter. We can, if we have leaks, if we don't handle security well, if we're not transparent with customers when things do go wrong, then all of the product improvements that actually make our product great don't matter, and because no one will use us. And so trust is one of those things that takes such a long time to build, but you can lose it so quickly. And so that's kind of the hard part for a startup, is like, why should we invest in security? Nothing bad has happened yet, but when it does, it's really bad. Like, it's something that startups will takes them a long time to recover from.
It's a matter of measuring risk. However, you're saying a large part of the risk is losing customer trust, but that's a very difficult thing to measure.
Yeah.
If you had a founder of a up-and-coming fintech in front of you, and they've been going for 6 months, would you say they need to be focusing on that immediately, like 6 months in, before they've even started? I mean, as practical advice.
Yeah. Matters differently for every single startup that's out there. I think that there are certain things that are becoming table stakes now. And I think if you're a fintech company, 2-factor authentication is just one of them. If you're holding money and credit card details for a customer, like, you just have to have it. Even if it's you're tokenizing it, so you're using Stripe or you're using some other payments provider. If people can make transfers or access funds that belong to one of your users, then you absolutely need to have 2FA in place. Like,
Day one,
not negotiable. And The really interesting thing is that from a legal standpoint, that's probably going to be mandated. Well, that is coming into effect with PSD2, strong customer authentication, and that is, I think it's a great law. I think it's an incredibly consumer friendly law to come into place. It's taken a lot of time to get here, but I think that pretty much mandates for fintech companies that they have to implement 2FA if they're allowing funds to be sent from one person to another person. If they're holding money on behalf of someone, then there's certain rules saying that someone has to go through strong authentication every 90 days. So there's these rules that are coming into place that are incredibly consumer friendly. Now, when you first start talking about this, like, the initial reaction is to think this is going to be super inconvenient. No one's going to use me because like they have to jump through all these hoops. But it's actually leveling the playing field in a really great way. And it goes back to that point around training customers. The regulation here is going to be great because every bank is going to have to operate under the same rules, whether you're a young bank or an old established bank. So when customers, who have accounts with Lloyds or with HSBC are going to have to, Lloyds and HSBC are going to be introducing their customers to this concept of authenticated transactions and 2FA and all of that. So it's not a burden that the fintech alone has to bear, educating and training customers. It's actually something that across the whole financial landscape they're going to encounter. And so what's been really interesting to us is that things where you would think security is an inconvenience turn out not to be. In fact, the lack of security can often turn people away more than the intrusion of security into the user experience. So things like, even basic things like email verification, blocking users' access to their account until they've verified their email. We ran A/B tests on this. It didn't actually impact perception or convenience of the product at all. In fact, people were reassured that you were doing things like that. Likewise with 2FA, it surprisingly has very little impact on conversion rate or on convenience because these are things that people are beginning to expect, and that's only going to increase over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and with providers like Twilio, who are providing plug-in products, it's actually far more accessible for startups as well. I mean, Barclays and Lloyds Bank and HSBC have the facility to build something from scratch, whereas two guys just starting their company don't really, but Twilio's offering that.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So I think the Twilio solution has been great because it's scaled for us, obviously with our user base quite well, and it's very accessible for younger companies to come in and use. So I think there's almost no excuse not to have it in place now. In the same, and for a lot of modern web frameworks, it simply weren't mature when Transferwise was started. When you think about Ruby on Rails and other frameworks that most startups would use nowadays for creating a website or an API, it's super easy to plug in security features into them. In fact, when you look at Rails has a lot of smart, sensible defaults around security. And when you look at, if you follow those best practices and if you are using those frameworks, it's very easy to provide these security features for customers. So building a startup, especially when it's two guys, in a room, is always going to be super difficult balance of what do you build next? Where do you prioritize? Why should we focus on security when we should be building a product and getting revenue? But security is going to become just table stakes.
And in so many places it links into other aspects of building a business. If customers are using One Touch with Transferwise, they're downloading your app onto their phone and you're getting real estate on their smartphone. And I bet your marketing team's quite happy about that.
Oh, it's win-win, right?
Yeah.
And that's like a secondary objective, but it absolutely helps because, there are a lot of people who discover Transferwise through SEO. They come through us through Google, and so their entire interaction with us is through the web, not through the App Store. And so if we can be more convenient for them, if we can educate them, hey, we've got an app as well, then that's great. That gives us another avenue to talk to our customers and to engage with them.
So you were talking about, I wanted to go back to the legal piece that we were talking about earlier, because you were saying that PSD2 is going to standardize 2FA essentially across the board. What about the other regulation that's coming in, GDPR? How is that going to affect Transferwise, and how do you see it affecting the larger sort of landscape?
GDPR is a big hurdle to implement, but I think that, again, everyone is going to have to be doing it. People are going to be trained in it, which is great. For us, we've been thinking about it for a long time now, about how to integrate it really well into the user experience. And the good thing is that a lot of the stuff that you need to do for GDPR can also help you be more secure. as a company. So when you look at having to keep track of when users updated their phone numbers, when they viewed their personally identifiable information, being able to provide auditable logs of all of these actions, these are really great features for users, but also really great features for security teams when trying to spot abnormal behavior or fraudulent activity. So every cloud has a silver lining. Yeah.
Yeah. So all companies operating in the EU are going to have to implement GDPR, but of course, smaller companies who are only just starting and maybe have fewer customers than you at Transferwise are in a stronger position to implement that into their systems because they're not retrofitting. But I wonder how GDPR strategies might differ between that example of two guys starting up their fintech company and larger corporations like Google or even Transferwise.
The hardest part for Transferwise is that we're 850 people now. We have 160 engineers spread across 9 offices, right? So when you look at the entire Transferwise kind of platform, it's about it's hundreds of little components and microservices, and they all might talk to different third-party services for different needs, perfectly legitimate needs. As I mentioned, document verification. And so the big challenge for us is actually now having to identify the services we're using, where we're sending data, how we're sending it to it, what protections are we putting on it, are those providers GDPR compliant, all these sorts of things now that we have to go back and actually analyze and look at and document. Whereas a startup coming up now from the start is only going to be using GDPR compliant providers. They're going to be building with GDPR in mind and keeping track of all this stuff. You're going to see, certainly a lot of middleware, I think, for keeping track of user actions that you need to under GDPR. It wouldn't surprise me already if there's stuff out there that you can just plug into a Ruby on Rails application or, a Node.js app to kind of help you keep tabs on what you're doing and to analyze that ahead of time. That's just inevitable. So I think for younger startups, it's very easy to implement from the ground up now. Whereas for Transferwise, it's a huge deal. I think it's to bring all those different, bits of information together.
What advice would you give to a startup who want to be transparent about their cybersecurity?
I would advise them to be open about kind of the tools and the technologies that they're using.
Specific technologies?
Well, I think that people are expecting, certainly an early stage startup will probably be adopted by more tech-friendly people at the beginning. So when you are talking about using Twilio One Touch, for example, being upfront like we use Twilio for our security can be a really big boon for them. I think you're starting to see some really great examples of companies who are putting logos on websites around, when they've been accredited by certain agencies and things like that. So Transferwise, for example, has been accredited by TÜV, a German agency, which looks at how safe and trustworthy and reputable companies are, and we got an excellent rating with them. And so we put that audit logo on our homepage for our German customers, and we actually saw conversion increase dramatically by about 15%, which is incredible. So customers, you've got to know for a startup who your customers are and what are the things that matter to them and influence them about trust, and be transparent about those things. And that differs for everyone. For our German customers, this logo made a big difference. They didn't really care that Richard Branson had invested in Transferwise, but they really cared that TÜV was, had accredited and had audited us. It really just comes down to understanding your customers as well as you possibly can. What information do they need to know in order to trust us?
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Okay. That wraps it up for this week. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and remember to subscribe. We're available for any device. Apple users, we're on iTunes. For Android users, we're on Stitcher, and any other devices, SoundCloud, we're there.
A huge thank you to Barclays Rise London for letting us use their amazing recording studio and for helping us up our sound quality.
If Ed's voice is new to you, you should definitely head over to one of our pages to catch up. In the Twilio webinar recording, Ed and Tom discussed account security and 2FA.
Of course, we welcome you to get in contact with us, whether it's to give feedback, ask questions, make a proposal for future episodes, or just say hi. Our email is charge@develop.co.uk. On Twitter, our handle is develop_team, and our hashtag is chargepodcast.
So, goodbye from Ed, Maria, Christina, and me.
Bye.
Bye.
And catch you next time.